the sweltering heat of a Kentucky summer in 1857, a young woman named Delilah made a choice that would send shockwaves through the entire Commonwealth and expose the most twisted contradictions buried deep within American law. She was 21 years old, 5 years into a nightmare that had begun the moment she was purchased at auction, and on that August night, she decided that not one more dawn would break with her still trapped in hell. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What Delilah did in those desperate hours would horrify investigators, split her community down the middle, and force a legal system built on oppression to confront its own monstrous hypocrisy. She had discovered a way to silence her tormentor permanently, but what she would learn in the brutal months that followed was that even when a woman fights for her own survival, the law was designed from its very foundation to crush her. This is the account of a woman who refused to accept her fate as a perpetual victim, but who would stand trial in a courtroom where her suffering meant absolutely nothing. An investigation that would lay bare how justice protected monsters and condemned those who dared to save themselves. A case where real justice would never see the light of day. Over the next hour, we're going to examine courthouse documents from Henderson County, study witness statements that were recorded in fading ink, and piece together an August night that changed everything for everyone it touched. Get ready for a journey into the archives that will shake your understanding of right and wrong, vengeance and survival, and the price one woman paid for wanting to be treated as human. Benjamin Thornwell came to Henderson County, Kentucky in 1828, making the journey from North Carolina with his young wife Rachel and a dream of building an empire on the fertile soil along the Green River. His timing was deliberate. Kentucky had entered the Union as a slave state back in 1792, and by the late 1820s, the region had become a magnet for families from the deeper South who wanted to expand their holdings without the complications of federal oversight that were starting to emerge in other territories. Thornwell purchased 650 acres of prime bottomland, perfect for tobacco cultivation, the cash crop that was turning ordinary farmers into wealthy gentlemen throughout the Ohio River Valley. The property stretched along a bend in the river, where the soil was dark and rich, renewed each spring by flooding that deposited fresh sediment across the fields. Within 5 years, Benjamin had transformed raw wilderness into a productive plantation that generated income substantial enough to place him among the county's elite. The main house he constructed was a statement of ambition, a 2-story brick structure with tall windows and a wide porch that faced south toward the tobacco fields. The architecture borrowed from the Georgian style, popular among the planter class, with symmetrical wings and a central hallway designed to catch cross breezes during the oppressive summer months. It was a house built to impress, to announce that Benjamin Thornwell had arrived and intended to stay. By 1850, Thornwell's holdings had expanded considerably. Tax records from that year show he owned property valued at over $4,000, a fortune that placed him in the top tier of Henderson County landowners. His farm produced thousands of pounds of tobacco annually, along with corn, wheat, and livestock that supplied both his household and the market in Waverly, the nearest town of any size. The labor force that made this prosperity possible consisted of 5 adult male slaves and 1 young boy, all housed in rough cabins behind the main house. The absence of adult female slaves on the property was notable and intentional. Benjamin had deliberately avoided purchasing women workers for reasons that would soon reveal themselves to be sinister beyond measure. Kentucky in 1850 occupied a peculiar position in the national debate over slavery. As a border state, it maintained the institution while also hosting growing communities of abolitionists and free black residents. The Underground Railroad ran through several Kentucky counties, and tensions between pro-slavery forces and those opposed to the system created an atmosphere of suspicion and violence. Henderson County itself was deeply divided, with some families secretly helping fugitives reach the Ohio River in freedom, while others organized patrols to capture runaways and maintain the racial hierarchy through intimidation and terror. Benjamin Thornwell's household functioned smoothly for 2 decades, with his wife Rachel managing domestic affairs and raising their 2 daughters, Margaret and Elizabeth. Rachel was known in the community as a devout woman who attended the Methodist Church in Waverly every Sunday and involved herself in charitable work among poor white families. Her presence in the household provided a moderating influence on Benjamin, whose temper and harsh treatment of his enslaved workers were known to neighbors but generally overlooked as the prerogative of a property owner. The death of Rachel Thornwell in the winter of 1850 marked a turning point that would prove catastrophic for everyone on the plantation. She succumbed to pneumonia during a particularly brutal cold snap, leaving Benjamin widowed at 51 and their daughters without maternal guidance. Margaret, the elder daughter, had married young but returned home after her husband died in a farming accident, bringing her 10-year-old son, Timothy, with her. Elizabeth remained unmarried at 17, still living under her father's roof and expected to manage the household in her mother's absence. With Rachel gone, something dark and predatory awakened in Benjamin Thornwell. The moral restraint she had represented, the social pressure to maintain respectability, the simple presence of a wife who might question or judge his actions, all of these disappeared into the frozen ground with her coffin. Her daughters, despite taking over domestic responsibilities, lacked the authority or the will to challenge their father's behavior. Margaret, as a widow dependent on Benjamin's generosity, could not risk his anger. Elizabeth, still essentially a child herself, was too frightened and too conditioned to obedience to speak against paternal authority. In the spring of 1851, Benjamin Thornwell made a trip to Louisville, traveling the 90 miles north to attend a public slave auction advertised throughout the region. Officially, he told his daughters he needed to purchase additional labor for the tobacco harvest. In reality, he was hunting for something specific, a young female who could be molded and controlled, someone without family nearby,
who might interfere or offer protection. The Louisville slave market was one of the largest in Kentucky, a hub where enslaved people from across the Upper South were bought and sold like livestock. Auction days drew crowds of planters, speculators, and curious onlookers who watched as human beings stood on platforms while auctioneers cataloged their qualities and defects. The atmosphere was carnival-like on the surface, but underneath ran currents of terror and despair as families were torn apart and individuals sold to unknown fates. Delilah Harmon was 16 years old when she stood on the auction block that May morning. She had been born somewhere in central Kentucky, the daughter of enslaved parents whose names were never recorded in any document that survived. Her mother had died when Delilah was young, and her father had been sold away when the estate of their previous owner was divided among heirs. She stood alone now, with no family connections and no one to advocate for her welfare or even remember her name once she disappeared into Benjamin Thornwell's wagon. The auction record noted simply that Benjamin purchased one Negro girl, age approximately 16, for $320. It was a significant sum, reflecting both Delilah's youth and her potential value as a worker. But Benjamin Thornwell was not thinking about field labor or domestic service when he made his bid. He was purchasing a victim, someone young enough to be completely under his control, isolated enough to have no recourse, and legally defined as his property in every sense that mattered.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A journey from Louisville back to Henderson County took 5 days, traveling rutted roads that wound through small settlements and long stretches of wilderness. Benjamin and Delilah did not travel alone. There were other men returning from the auction with their purchases, and the group camped together at night for safety from bandits and wild animals. But on the second night, when the group made camp near a creek far from any town, Benjamin led Delilah away from the fire on the pretext of fetching water.
What happened in the darkness beyond the firelight that night established a pattern of violation that would continue unbroken for the next 6 years. Delilah was raped for the first time by the man who now legally owned her, and she learned immediately that resistance would be met with violence. Benjamin made it clear through both words and actions that she existed solely for his use, and that any attempt to resist or tell others would result in punishment she could not imagine. When they arrived at the Thornwell plantation, Benjamin had already prepared for Delilah's arrival. He had constructed a separate cabin for her, built of stone rather than the rough wood of the other slave quarters. The structure sat 60 yards from the main house, positioned in a grove of oak trees that provided visual screening from both the main house and the other cabins. The placement was strategic, close enough for Benjamin to access easily during his nighttime visits, but far enough to maintain the illusion of separation between his respectable household and his private depravity. The cabin was small but solidly built, with a stone fireplace, a dirt floor, and a single window that faced away from the main house. Benjamin furnished it with a bed, a table, and a few basic cooking implements. To anyone who asked, and few did, this was where the new cook would live. Everyone on the plantation understood the real purpose of the isolated cabin, but no one spoke of it. The other enslaved men knew that acknowledging what happened to Delilah would bring savage punishment down on their own heads. Silence was survival. Margaret and Elizabeth Thornwell also knew what their father was doing. They saw Delilah arrive, watched her being installed in the special cabin, noticed their father's nighttime absences and morning returns, but they said nothing. Perhaps they were ashamed. Perhaps they feared confronting Benjamin would only make things worse for everyone. Perhaps they had internalized the belief that enslaved women were not fully human and therefore could not really be violated. Whatever their reasons, their silence made them complicit in the horror unfolding just yards from where they slept. Delilah's first months on the Thornwell plantation were a descent into a hell more complete than anything she had imagined during the terror of the auction block. She was given tasks in the main house kitchen, learning to prepare the meals that fed the Thornwell family. But her primary function was understood by everyone, including Delilah herself. She existed to satisfy Benjamin Thornwell's sexual desires, and there was no authority on earth she could appeal to for protection. Benjamin visited the cabin multiple times each week, usually after dark when the rest of the household was asleep. He never asked permission. He never showed kindness or consideration. He simply took what he believed he owned, and Delilah learned that resistance only prolonged the ordeal and increased her physical injuries. She developed a strategy of dissociation, of removing her mind from her body during the attacks, of retreating to some internal space where she could preserve a fragment of herself that Benjamin could not touch. The isolation Benjamin had engineered was brutally effective. Delilah had no family to turn to, no mother to comfort her, no father to defend her. The other enslaved people on the plantation were too frightened to offer more than furtive glances of sympathy. Margaret and Elizabeth Thornwell, the only other women on the property, had made their choice to look away. Delilah was completely alone in her suffering. Kentucky law in 1851 was explicitly designed to prevent enslaved people from seeking justice against their owners. Slaves could not testify in court against white people. They could not enter into contracts or make legal agreements. They could not own property or retain earnings. Most relevant to Delilah's situation, there was no law in Kentucky that recognized the rape of an enslaved woman as a crime. Sexual assault required the victim to be a person with legal rights, and enslaved women were legally categorized as property, not persons. Benjamin Thornwell could not be prosecuted for raping Delilah any more than he could be prosecuted for using his horse or his plow. In the winter of 1852, when Delilah was 17 years old, she gave birth to her first child in the stone cabin where she had been imprisoned for nearly a year. There was no doctor present, no midwife skilled in easing the pain of childbirth.
Margaret Thornwell came to the cabin only after the labor was well underway, bringing clean rags and water, but offering little comfort or assistance. The baby, a girl, arrived after hours of agonizing labor that left Delilah weak and bleeding on the bed Benjamin had purchased for his own purposes. The paternity was never in question. Her features, even in infancy, reflected Benjamin Thornwell's lineage in ways that made her parentage unmistakable to anyone who looked. The baby had lighter skin than Delilah, a common characteristic of mixed-race children, and as she grew, other resemblances to the Thornwell family became apparent. Margaret and Elizabeth found themselves confronted daily with the living evidence of their father's crimes, a half-sister they could never acknowledge, a niece whose existence they pretended not to understand. Benjamin showed no interest in the child beyond ensuring she did not interfere with his continued access to Delilah. Within weeks of giving birth, Delilah was expected to resume all her duties, both in the kitchen and in submitting to Benjamin's nighttime visits. The demands of caring for an infant while cooking for the main house and enduring regular sexual assault pushed Delilah to the edge of physical collapse, but she discovered reserves of strength she had not known she possessed. The baby became her reason to survive, a small person who depended entirely on her and who represented something pure in a world of corruption. Life on the Thornwell plantation continued its brutal routine through 1852 and into 1853. The tobacco crops were good, bringing Benjamin substantial profits that he invested in more land and equipment. The enslaved men worked from dawn until dark during the growing season, their labor generating wealth that flowed entirely into Benjamin's coffers, while they received nothing but minimal food and shelter. Isaac, one of the younger enslaved men, had been purchased by Benjamin in 1850, arriving just months before Delilah. He was strong and intelligent, qualities that made him valuable for the hardest physical labor, but also made him dangerous in Benjamin's eyes, a man who might have thoughts of resistance or escape. Isaac had watched Delilah's arrival and had understood immediately what her fate would be. He saw her isolation, witnessed her visible deterioration during those first months, noticed when she was pregnant and later when she appeared in the kitchen with an infant strapped to her back. He felt a mixture of rage and helplessness, the impotent fury of a man who could do nothing to protect someone being destroyed in front of him. To interfere would mean death, either by hanging if he struck Benjamin, or by being sold away to the Deep South, which was often a slower form of death. So Isaac, like the others, said nothing and did nothing, and the guilt of his silence aided him like acid. By 1854, something had shifted in Isaac's interactions with Delilah. Their paths crossed regularly during the day, in the kitchen where she worked, and where he sometimes came to carry water or bring wood for the stove. They began exchanging glances that lasted a moment too long, words that carried meanings beyond their surface content. Isaac started finding reasons to be near the oak grove where Delilah's cabin stood, not approaching directly, but making his presence known, a silent message that she was not entirely alone in the world. Delilah, starved for any human connection that was not based on violence and control, found herself responding to Isaac's attention with a desperate hope she had thought was dead. Here was someone who looked at her as a person, who spoke to her with respect, who seemed to see beyond her status as Benjamin's property and victim. The connection that developed between them was dangerous and forbidden, not because of any law that recognized enslaved people's relationships, but because it represented a challenge to Benjamin's absolute ownership of Delilah's body and heart. Their relationship developed in stolen moments and secret meetings, on nights when Benjamin did not visit the cabin, when he was away in Waverly on business or too drunk to make the walk across the property. Isaac would slip through the darkness to Delilah's door. They talked in whispers, shared the small intimacies that free people took for granted, held each other with a tenderness that stood in stark contrast to the brutality that defined Delilah's existence. For the first time since being sold at auction, Delilah experienced what it meant to choose to be with someone, to be wanted for reasons that had nothing to do with exploitation. These moments of consensual affection awakened in Delilah something that years of abuse had nearly destroyed, a sense of her own worth as a human being. Isaac treated her with a gentleness that made Benjamin's violence even more unbearable by comparison. When Isaac touched her, it was with permission sought and given. When he spoke to her, it was as an equal, not as property. This relationship, fragile and dangerous as it was, gave Delilah back a piece of her humanity that Benjamin had been systematically trying to crush. In the spring of 1855, Delilah gave birth to her second child, a boy this time, whose features also clearly indicated Benjamin Thornwell's paternity. The pregnancy had been difficult, with Delilah suffering severe illness throughout that left her unable to keep food down, and so weak she could barely stand for long periods. Yet Benjamin had not reduced his demands on her, either for labor or for sexual access. He seemed to view her physical suffering as a minor inconvenience that did not affect his rights as her owner. The birth of the second child deepened the horror of Delilah's situation. She now had 2 small children living in the cabin with her, both of whom were also legally Benjamin's property, both of whom witnessed their mother's ongoing abuse at the hands of their biological father. The older child, now 3 years old, was beginning to understand that the white man who came in the darkness and hurt her mother was the same man they saw during the day at the main house. The psychological damage being inflicted on these children was immeasurable, but there was no one who cared to measure it. Isaac's reaction to the second pregnancy was complex. He loved Delilah, or believed he did, but the visible evidence that Benjamin continued to rape her filled him with a jealous fury he struggled to control. He understood intellectually that Delilah had no power to refuse Benjamin, that she was being assaulted rather than engaging in any kind of consensual relationship. But emotions are not always rational, and seeing her pregnant again with another man's child, even under these circumstances, triggered feelings Isaac had difficulty processing. The relationship between Isaac and Delilah became strained after the second child's birth. Isaac pulled away emotionally, visiting less frequently, speaking to her with a distance that had not been there before. Delilah felt the withdrawal acutely, recognizing that she was losing the one source of genuine human connection she had found. She tried to explain to Isaac that she had no choice, that Benjamin forced himself on her regardless of her wishes, but words felt inadequate to bridge the gap that had opened between them. The political situation beyond the Thornwell plantation was growing increasingly volatile. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 had inflamed tensions between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces, leading to violent confrontations in Kansas that newspapers called Bleeding Kansas. The conflict was spreading, with border states like Kentucky becoming battlegrounds for competing visions of America's future. Some families were helping enslaved people escape to freedom via the Underground Railroad, while others formed vigilante groups to hunt down runaways and terrorize anyone suspected of abolitionist sympathies. Benjamin Thornwell paid attention to these developments with growing alarm. The social order that guaranteed his wealth and power was being questioned and challenged in ways that had seemed impossible just a decade earlier. He responded by tightening control over his enslaved workers, implementing harsher punishments for minor infractions, and making an example of anyone who seemed to harbor thoughts of freedom or resistance. The atmosphere on the plantation became even more oppressive, with everyone walking carefully and speaking in whispers. By early 1857, Delilah discovered she was pregnant for the 3rd time. The realization filled her with despair so profound she could barely function. Another child meant another person who would be born into slavery, another witness to her degradation, another claim on her heart that could be used to control and hurt her. But more immediately, the pregnancy meant months of physical misery, as her previous pregnancies had been marked by severe sickness that left her debilitated. This time, however, there was an additional complication. The timing of conception meant the child could be either Benjamin's or Isaac's. Delilah had been with both men during the relevant period, though with Benjamin it was always rape, and with Isaac it had been the rare occasions when they still connected despite the strain in their relationship. The uncertainty of paternity added a new dimension of complexity to an already impossible situation. When Isaac learned of the pregnancy, his reaction was immediate and devastating. He told Delilah that he could not continue their relationship if she remained sexually available to Benjamin. It was an ultimatum born of pain and frustration, but it revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of Delilah's reality. She was not sexually available to Benjamin by choice. She was being raped on a regular basis by a man who owned her and who could do whatever he wanted without legal consequence. Isaac's demand that she stop Benjamin was asking the impossible. Delilah tried to explain this to Isaac, pleading with him to understand that she had no power to refuse her owner. But Isaac, consumed by his own anguish and unable to fully grasp the totality of her powerlessness, remained firm in his ultimatum. If she could not find a way to stop Benjamin, he would have nothing more to do with her. The relationship that had been Delilah's only source of affection and human connection was crumbling, and she faced losing even that small comfort. The pregnancy progressed with brutal symptoms that made Delilah's work nearly impossible. She suffered from constant nausea that left cooking smells unbearable, from dizziness that left her swaying over the stove, from exhaustion so profound she could barely lift the pots and pans required for her duties. Margaret Thornwell noticed Delilah's condition, but showed little sympathy, viewing the pregnancy as an inconvenience that disrupted household routines. Elizabeth, now 24 and still unmarried, avoided Delilah entirely, unable or unwilling to confront the reality of what her father was doing. Despite Delilah's deteriorating physical condition, Benjamin continued his nighttime visits to the cabin without interruption or modification. He showed no concern for her illness, no consideration for the fact that she was pregnant and struggling. His entitlement was absolute, his belief in his rights as an owner unshakable. Delilah was his property, and property existed to serve the owner's needs regardless of any other consideration. In late July 1857, Delilah made a decision that required extraordinary courage. She would approach Margaret and Elizabeth directly and ask them to intervene with their father on her behalf. It was a desperate gamble that could easily backfire, resulting in punishment for her presumption in addressing white women about such matters. But Delilah had reached a point where she had nothing left to lose. She was pregnant, sick, facing abandonment by Isaac, and unable to endure even one more of Benjamin's assaults. Delilah found her opportunity one afternoon when Benjamin had traveled to Waverly for a meeting with other tobacco planters. She approached Margaret in the main house, where the older woman was overseeing her son Timothy's lessons. Delilah asked, with all the humility and deference she could muster, if Margaret might speak to Benjamin about leaving her alone while she was so ill. She did not explicitly mention the sexual nature of the visits, maintaining a fiction of propriety, but the meaning was clear to everyone involved. Margaret's response was a study in willful blindness and complicity. She did not feign ignorance about what Delilah was asking. She did not express shock or demand clarification. Instead, she simply stated that such matters were beyond her authority, that her father's business was his own, and that Delilah should not trouble her with inappropriate requests. It was a calculated refusal to help, a choice to prioritize her own comfort and security over any obligation to another human being in desperate need. Elizabeth, when Delilah tried to approach her separately, was even less helpful. The younger woman actually fled from the conversation, retreating to her room and refusing to discuss the matter at all. Her avoidance was perhaps less cruel than Margaret's cold dismissal, but the effect was the same. Neither of Benjamin's daughters would lift a finger to protect Delilah from their father's predation. The failure of this attempt at intervention left Delilah with only one option remaining. She would have to confront Benjamin Thornwell directly, knowing that such confrontation could result in severe punishment or even death. But the alternative was to continue as she had been, and that had become literally unbearable. Something in Delilah had broken and reformed into something harder, a determination that had not existed before. She would speak to Benjamin, and she would make him understand that she could not continue this way. The opportunity came on the evening of August 13th.
Benjamin had returned from Waverley in a good mood, having concluded a favorable deal for his tobacco crop that would bring substantial profit. He dined with his daughters and grandson, unaware that in the stone cabin across the property, a woman was preparing to confront her master.
Preparing to challenge his absolute authority for the first time in 6 years. After dinner, as twilight settled over the plantation and the August heat began to moderate slightly, Delilah waited in her cabin with her heart pounding against her ribs. She had sent the children to stay with one of the other enslaved families, claiming she was too ill to care for them properly that evening. She needed to be alone for what was about to happen, whatever that turned out to be. When Benjamin appeared at her door around 9 in the evening, Delilah was ready. She stood to face him as he entered, and before he could speak or advance toward her, she began to plead. She begged him to leave her alone, at least while she was pregnant and so sick. She explained that she could barely stand, that she felt constantly on the verge of collapse, that his continued demands were destroying what little health she had left. She spoke with as much deference as she could manage, trying to appeal to whatever humanity might exist beneath his sense of ownership and entitlement. Benjamin's response was exactly what Delilah had feared, but somehow still hoped might be different. He dismissed her pleas entirely, telling her that her discomfort was irrelevant to his rights as her owner. He stated clearly that he would use his property as he saw fit, and that her opinions on the matter were of no consequence whatsoever. Then, to remove any doubt about his intentions, he informed her that he would be returning later that very night, after the household was asleep, and that she had better be prepared to receive him. This final rejection, delivered with such casual cruelty and absolute certainty, was the breaking point Delilah had been approaching for months. She had exhausted every legitimate option for relief. She had asked for help from Benjamin's daughters and been refused. She had pleaded directly with Benjamin and been dismissed. She faced abandonment by Isaac if she could not find a way to stop the assaults. Her physical condition was deteriorating rapidly under the combined stress of pregnancy, illness, and ongoing trauma. In that moment, listening to Benjamin inform her that he would return to rape her again in just a few hours, something fundamental shifted in Delilah's mind. She was no longer thinking about survival through submission. She was no longer calculating how to minimize harm through cooperation. Instead, she was thinking about resistance, about fighting back, about making it stop by any means necessary. After Benjamin left the cabin, returning to the main house to wait for full darkness before making his planned visit, Delilah began to prepare. Her preparations were methodical and deliberate, demonstrating a clarity of purpose that had crystallized out of years of suffering and months of mounting desperation. She was done being a victim. Whatever happened next, she would not passively accept another assault. Delilah selected a heavy piece of firewood from the stack beside her fireplace, a length of hickory about as thick as her wrist and as long as her forearm. She tested its weight in her hand, feeling how it balanced, imagining how it would feel to swing it with all her strength. The wood was solid and hard, capable of inflicting serious damage if wielded with sufficient force. She placed it carefully within reach of where she knew she would be standing when Benjamin entered later that night. The hours between Benjamin's departure and his expected return stretched out with agonizing slowness. Delilah sat in her cabin, listening to the sounds of the plantation settling into nighttime quiet. She heard the enslaved men returning to their quarters after completing their evening tasks. She heard voices from the main house growing quieter as the Thornwell family prepared for bed. She heard the ordinary sounds of a summer night in Kentucky, crickets and frogs and the distant call of an owl hunting in the oak grove. Delilah did not pray during those hours of waiting. She had long since lost any faith that divine intervention would save her from Benjamin Thornwell. If God existed and cared about the suffering of enslaved women, surely he would have intervened years ago, during the first rape or the second or the 100th. No, Delilah was not counting on God. She was counting on herself, on the strength left in her arms and the determination that had hardened in her heart. As the night deepened and the moon rose over the tobacco fields, Delilah heard the sound she had been anticipating with a mixture of dread and cold resolve. Footsteps approaching through the darkness, the familiar rhythm of Benjamin Thornwell's walk, steady and confident, because he had no reason to expect anything different from the hundreds of previous visits he had made to this cabin over 6 years. The door opened, and Benjamin stepped inside, a dark silhouette against the slightly lighter darkness outside. He closed the door behind him, sealing them both into the space where so much horror had already occurred. He moved forward with the assurance of a man who had never been challenged, never been resisted, never had reason to question his absolute authority over the woman who stood waiting in the shadows. Delilah backed into the corner of the cabin, her hand finding the hickory wood she had positioned there hours earlier. Her fingers closed around it, feeling the rough bark still clinging to the surface. Her muscles tensed, preparing for an action she had never taken before but had imagined countless times during the past 6 years. Benjamin interpreted her movement into the corner as the usual resistance, the token defiance that always preceded submission. He continued advancing, reaching out to grab her arm as he had done so many times before. He was completely unprepared for what happened next. Delilah raised the hickory wood and brought it down with every ounce of strength her weakened body could generate. The impact connected with the side of Benjamin's head, producing a sound that would echo in Delilah's memory for the rest of her life, the crack of wood against skull, solid and final. Benjamin staggered, his hand releasing her arm as he stumbled sideways. He made a sound, not quite a scream but a groan of pain and confusion, the noise of a man who had never experienced real resistance and could not process what was happening. He did not fall, not from that first blow. Instead, he steadied himself against the table, one hand going to his head where blood was already beginning to flow. He turned toward Delilah, and even in the darkness, she could see the rage forming in his expression. He raised his hands. Whether to grab her or to defend himself, she would never know, and that movement sealed his fate. Delilah swung the hickory wood again, this time aiming for the back of his skull as he turned. The second blow landed with even greater force than the first, driven by 6 years of accumulated rage and terror and desperation.
Dropping first to his knees and then falling forward onto the dirt floor of the cabin. He moved briefly, a spasm that might have been voluntary or might have been simple nerve response, and then he was still. Delilah stood over Benjamin Thornwell's body, breathing hard, still gripping the bloodied piece of hickory wood. She waited for him to move again, to get up, to grab her and begin the savage beating she knew would come. But he did not move. The shape on the floor remained motionless except for the slow spread of dark liquid pooling beneath his head. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Delilah had crossed a line from which there could be no return. She had killed a white man, her owner, the father of her children. Under Kentucky law, this was the most serious crime an enslaved person could commit. The penalty was death, universally and without exception. There would be no trial that considered her circumstances, no jury that weighed her years of suffering against her moment of violence. She had killed her master, and that was all that would matter to the law. But Delilah did not panic. Instead, standing in the darkness with Benjamin Thornwell's corpse at her feet, she began to think with a clarity that was almost frightening in its precision. Killing Benjamin was only the first step. Now she had to make his body disappear so completely that no one would ever know what had happened to him. It was an impossible task, but it was her only chance at survival. Delilah stood motionless in the darkness for what might have been minutes or hours, her sense of time distorted by shock and adrenaline. Benjamin Thornwell's body lay crumpled on the dirt floor, blood spreading in a dark pool that reflected the faint moonlight coming through the window. The piece of hickory wood remained clutched in her hand, its surface sticky with blood that was already beginning to dry. The reality of what she had done settled over her like a physical weight, pressing down on her chest and making it difficult to breathe. But even in the midst of this overwhelming moment, Delilah's mind was working with a strange clarity. She understood instinctively that her survival depended entirely on what she did in the next few hours. If Benjamin's body was discovered, she would be executed without question or delay. Kentucky law provided no mercy for enslaved people who killed white owners, regardless of circumstances or provocation. Her only chance was to make Benjamin Thornwell disappear so completely that no one would ever know he had died in this cabin. The first challenge was the body itself. Benjamin weighed close to 200 pounds, far more than Delilah could easily move even when she was healthy and strong. In her current condition, 3 months pregnant and weakened by constant illness, the task seemed impossible. Yet impossible was a luxury she could not afford. She dropped the hickory wood and knelt beside the body, forcing herself to touch the man who had violated her countless times, now reduced to dead weight that needed to be moved. Delilah grabbed Benjamin's arms and pulled, trying to drag him toward the fireplace. Her muscles screamed in protest, and her pregnant belly cramped with the effort, but she managed to move him a few inches across the dirt floor. She paused, gasping for breath, then pulled again. Inch by agonizing inch, she hauled Benjamin's corpse across the cabin floor, leaving a smeared trail of blood in the darkness. The physical exertion was tremendous, and several times she had to stop and rest, her body trembling with exhaustion and her vision swimming with dark spots. It took nearly an hour to move Benjamin the 15 feet from where he had fallen to the stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the cabin. By the time Delilah positioned him as close to the hearth as possible, she was drenched in sweat, despite the relative coolness of the August night. Her arms shook with fatigue and her back ached from the unnatural strain of dragging a body while pregnant. But the hardest work was still ahead of her. Delilah had decided that fire was her only option for destroying evidence. She had no way to bury Benjamin without leaving obvious signs of disturbed earth that would be discovered immediately. She could not carry him far from the cabin, and leaving him nearby would mean certain detection. Fire offered the possibility of reducing Benjamin to ash and bone fragments that might be hidden or dispersed, making identification impossible. It was a plan born of desperation rather than careful consideration, but it was the only plan she had. She began building the fire with a methodical focus that pushed aside exhaustion and fear. She gathered every piece of dry wood stored in the cabin, stacking it carefully in the fireplace to create maximum heat and airflow. She added kindling in small branches, arranging everything to burn as hot and as long as possible. When she was satisfied with the preparation, she used flint and steel to strike sparks into the tinder, coaxing flames to life and feeding them carefully until the fire began to roar. The heat from the growing blaze was immediate and intense, turning the small cabin into an oven. Delilah stripped off her outer dress, working in just her shift as sweat poured down her face and body. She continued adding wood to the fire, building it higher and hotter than any normal cooking fire, creating an inferno that began to consume the very air in the cabin. The flames reached up into the chimney, roaring with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the night. When the fire was burning at its peak intensity, Delilah faced the most horrific task of the entire night. She had to move Benjamin's body into the flames. The prospect filled her with a visceral horror that went beyond her fear of being caught. What she was about to do crossed boundaries that even 6 years of abuse had not prepared her for. She was about to burn a human body, to destroy through fire the mortal remains of another person, even one who had caused her immeasurable suffering. Delilah grabbed Benjamin's legs and pulled, dragging his upper body toward the fireplace opening. The heat was so intense she could barely stand it, her skin reddening and her hair beginning to singe. She maneuvered the corpse until his head and shoulders were positioned at the edge of the flames. Then, with a final desperate push, she shoved his upper body into the fire. The smell that immediately filled the cabin was beyond anything Delilah had imagined. Burning hair and skin created an acrid stench that made her gag and retch, her empty stomach heaving as she stumbled backward from the fireplace. The odor was unmistakable and horrible, a sweet, sick smell of cooking flesh mixed with the burning fabric of Benjamin's clothes and the underlying char of wood smoke. Delilah pulled her shift up over her nose and mouth, trying to filter the nauseating fumes, but nothing could completely block out the smell of what was happening. She forced herself to continue adding wood to the fire, pushing the fatty shoulders closer and closer to the hearth. Her body was screaming in protest, and her mind raced with questions that she had no answers for.
Working, knowing she could not stop until the job was complete. Benjamin's legs still protruded from the fireplace, and she pushed them forward, feeding his body into the flames inch by inch. The fire consumed his clothing first, the fabric flaring up and disintegrating rapidly. Then the flames began working on the flesh itself, the skin blackening and splitting, the underlying tissue beginning to char and contract. Delilah maintained the fire throughout the night, continuously adding wood to keep the temperature high enough to reduce Benjamin's body to ash and bone. She had to leave the cabin periodically to gather more fuel, slipping out into the darkness to collect fallen branches and dried wood from around the property. Each time she left, she scanned the area fearfully, terrified that someone might have noticed the unusual smoke or smelled the distinctive odor of burning flesh. But the plantation remained quiet, everyone else sleeping peacefully while Delilah worked through the night at her grim task. The process of completely incinerating a human body took far longer than Delilah had anticipated. Even with the intense heat she maintained, some parts of Benjamin's skeleton resisted complete destruction. The larger bones, particularly the skull and the thicker leg bones, remained stubbornly intact despite hours in the flames. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Delilah realized she had a new problem. Bone fragments that were clearly human remained in the fireplace, evidence that would condemn her instantly if discovered. Working with frantic urgency as the sky grew lighter, Delilah used fireplace tools to pull the larger bone pieces from the ash. They were still hot enough to burn her fingers, but she wrapped her hands in rags and worked through the pain. She carried the bones to a flat stone near the cabin and began the horrific work of crushing them into smaller pieces. Using rocks as hammers, she methodically pulverized each bone fragment, reducing them to sizes that might be mistaken for animal bones or overlooked entirely. The sound of rock striking bone echoed across the quiet plantation, and Delilah worked in terror that someone would wake and investigate. But the other enslaved people knew better than to question unusual sounds coming from Delilah's cabin, and the main house remained silent. She crushed bones until her arms ached and her hands were raw, creating a pile of fragments and powder that no longer resembled any recognizable human anatomy. Some of the bone pieces, particularly parts of the skull that had distinctive features, Delilah knew she could not leave in the fireplace or anywhere else they might be found. She made the decision to bury these fragments in multiple locations around the cabin. Using her hands to dig in the soft earth near the foundation, she created small holes where she deposited the most incriminating bone pieces, covering them carefully and scattering leaves and debris over the disturbed soil to make the hiding places less obvious. The smaller bone fragments and much of the ash from the fire presented a different challenge. Delilah needed to disperse this evidence across a wide area to prevent discovery. She gathered the ash and bone powder into a bucket, mixing it thoroughly so that the human remains were indistinguishable from ordinary wood ash. Then she faced the question of how to distribute this material without arousing suspicion. The solution came to her as the sun rose fully over the tobacco fields. She would recruit help from an innocent party who would never know what they were actually doing. Timothy Ashford, Margaret's 10-year-old son, often played near the oak grove. He was a child who would perform simple tasks for small rewards, and he would never suspect the true nature of what he was helping to dispose of. Delilah waited until mid-morning, when she judged the household would be awake and Timothy would be outside. She cleaned herself as best she could, washing away the sweat and ash and attempting to remove the smell of burning flesh that clung to her hair and skin. She changed into a clean dress and forced herself to appear calm despite the exhaustion and terror coursing through her body.
She found Timothy near the cherry tree that grew beside the stable, exactly where she had hoped he would be. She approached him with a forced smile and made her proposal. She had cleaned out her fireplace, she explained, and needed help spreading the ash along the garden path. The ash would be good for the soil, she told him, and she would pay him with a handful of nuts she had saved from her own rations. Timothy, always eager to earn small treats and seeing nothing unusual in the request, immediately agreed. Together, they filled buckets with the ash from Delilah's fireplace, ash that contained pulverized bone fragments from Benjamin Thornwell's body. The boy chatted cheerfully as they worked, talking about his lessons and his plans for the day, completely unaware that he was handling the mortal remains of his own grandfather. They walked along the path from the cabin toward the stable area, with Timothy enthusiastically scattering handfuls of ash as they went. Delilah directed him to spread it widely, to shake each handful so it dispersed across the path and into the grass on either side. The boy followed her instructions perfectly, creating a trail of mixed ash and bone powder that stretched across dozens of yards of the plantation property. When the buckets were empty, Delilah gave Timothy his promised reward and watched him run off to play, his innocence intact and his role in desecrating his grandfather's remains unknown to him. She returned to the cabin and began the final phase of cleaning, scrubbing every surface that might show blood or other evidence of what had happened the previous night. The dirt floor was the biggest challenge, as blood had soaked into the earth and could not be completely removed. Delilah dug up the most stained areas and carried the bloody soil out in small amounts, dispersing it in the woods away from the cabin. She replaced the removed soil with fresh earth from near the creek, smoothing and packing it to match the rest of the floor as closely as possible. She washed the walls with water and lye soap, removing every speck of blood spatter she could find. She cleaned her bedding and the few pieces of furniture in the cabin, working with a thoroughness born of absolute necessity. By noon, the cabin looked nearly normal, with only the lingering smell of the intense fire to suggest anything unusual had occurred. But Delilah had overlooked one crucial piece of evidence. In the chaos of the night, Benjamin had dropped his pocket watch, a distinctive item with his initials engraved on the case. The watch had fallen near the door and been kicked into a corner during the struggle and the subsequent body moving. It lay there now, a piece of metal and glass that had survived the fire and that could definitively prove Benjamin had been in the cabin.
Delilah discovered the watch when she was doing a final check of the cabin in the early afternoon. Her heart nearly stopped when she recognized what it was. She picked it up with shaking hands, the engraved initials seeming to accuse her. She could not burn it, as metal would not be destroyed by fire. She could not throw it in the creek, as it might be found. She needed to hide it somewhere it would never be discovered. After several minutes of desperate thought, Delilah made a decision. She would bury the watch in her small vegetable garden behind the cabin, in a spot where the earth was regularly disturbed for planting, and where a small hole would not look out of place. She went outside with the watch hidden in her apron pocket, knelt in the garden as if tending her plants, and quickly dug a hole about 8 inches deep. She dropped the watch in, covered it with soil, and planted a tomato seedling over the spot to disguise the fresh digging. As Delilah returned to the cabin, she allowed herself to feel a cautious hope that she might actually survive this. She had disposed of the body, dispersed the evidence, cleaned the scene, and hidden the one item that could definitively place Benjamin in her cabin. If she could maintain her composure and give no indication of guilt, perhaps the plantation would simply believe Benjamin had wandered off and met with some accident. But even as this hope formed, events were unfolding at the main house that would destroy any chance Delilah had of escaping detection. Margaret Thornwell had woken that morning expecting to see her father at breakfast, as was his invariable custom. When he did not appear, she assumed he was sleeping late or had gone out early to inspect the tobacco fields. But as the morning progressed and there was still no sign of Benjamin, her concern began to grow.
By noon, Margaret was actively searching for her father, checking his bedroom, the stable, the tobacco barn, and all the places he typically spent his time. She questioned the enslaved men, asking if any of them had seen Benjamin that morning. All reported they had not, which was highly unusual. Benjamin was a man of rigid habits, who was always visible on the plantation, supervising work and ensuring his property was being properly managed. Elizabeth joined the search, walking the property and calling for her father. The two women checked the creek, fearing Benjamin might have fallen and drowned, but found no evidence of any accident. They examined the roads leading away from the plantation, thinking he might have decided to ride to Waverly early, but his horse was still in the stable. As the afternoon wore on, the sisters' concern deepened into real fear. Margaret sent Timothy to fetch their neighbor, Thomas Brennan, asking him to bring men to help search for Benjamin. Brennan arrived within an hour, bringing several enslaved men from his own property to assist in a thorough search. The group spread out across the Thornwell plantation, examining every building, every field, every possible location where Benjamin might be found. Sheriff Edmund Parker was summoned from Waverly, arriving in the late afternoon with the authority to organize a formal investigation. Parker was a man in his 40s who had served as sheriff for nearly a decade. He had investigated numerous cases involving enslaved people, always approaching such investigations with the assumption that slaves were inherently criminal and deceptive. His presence meant the search for Benjamin Thornwell was now an official matter that would not be easily dismissed or forgotten. Parker began by questioning the enslaved men on the plantation, asking each one when they had last seen Benjamin and whether they had noticed anything unusual the previous night or that morning. The interviews were conducted with implicit threats, Parker making it clear that anyone found to be lying or concealing information would face severe punishment. The men all reported the same thing. They had last seen Benjamin at dinner the previous evening, and no one had seen or heard anything unusual during the night. Isaac, when questioned, felt a cold dread settling over him. He knew about Delilah's pregnancy and Benjamin's continued abuse. He had issued his ultimatum that she find a way to stop the assaults or lose his affection. And now, Benjamin was missing under mysterious circumstances. Isaac feared that Delilah might have done something desperate, but he had no proof and dared not voice his suspicions to the white sheriff, who would immediately arrest her. When Parker asked Isaac if he had any theories about Benjamin's disappearance, the younger man made a statement that would prove fateful. He said that if Benjamin had gone anywhere the previous night, it would most likely have been toward the stone cabin where Delilah lived. It was a comment born of Isaac's knowledge of Benjamin's habits, but it directed the investigation's focus exactly where Delilah most feared it would go. Parker immediately turned his attention to the oak grove and the stone cabin. He walked the path from the main house, examining the ground for any signs of disturbance. He noticed the fresh ash scattered along the path, an unusual amount for a simple cleaning of a fireplace. He knelt and examined the ash more closely, noting what appeared to be small bone fragments mixed with the gray powder. The sheriff arrived at Delilah's cabin with Thomas Brennan and 2 of his men following close behind. Delilah was inside with her 2 children,
trying to maintain an appearance of normalcy while terror gripped her heart. When Parker knocked on the door and ordered her to come out, she knew her desperate gamble had failed. The investigation had found her, and now she would have to face whatever consequences followed. Parker began his interrogation immediately, not even allowing Delilah to fully exit the cabin before demanding to know when she had last seen Benjamin Thornwell. Delilah, her mind racing, claimed she had not seen him since the previous afternoon when he had come to the kitchen for water. It was a lie, but it was the only protection she had. The sheriff did not believe her. He pushed past Delilah into the cabin and began examining the interior with the practiced eye of someone looking for evidence of foul play. The cabin appeared clean and ordinary at first glance, but Parker noticed several details that aroused his suspicion. The fireplace showed signs of an unusually intense fire, with soot marks extending higher up the chimney than a normal cooking fire would produce. The dirt floor near the fireplace looked freshly turned, as if soil had been recently removed and replaced. Parker ordered his men to search the cabin thoroughly while he continued questioning Delilah outside. His interrogation tactics were brutal and designed to break her resistance through fear and intimidation. He told her that he knew she was lying, that evidence of a crime was obvious, and that unless she told the truth immediately, she would face punishment beyond anything she could imagine. Delilah maintained her denial, insisting she knew nothing about Benjamin's disappearance. But Parker could see the fear in her eyes, the way her hands trembled, the sweat beading on her forehead despite the relative coolness of the afternoon. He changed his approach, using a different tactic to extract a confession. Parker told Delilah that Isaac had already revealed everything, that the other enslaved man had confessed to witnessing what happened, and that Delilah's only hope of any mercy was to tell her own version of events before the sheriff heard it entirely from others. It was a complete fabrication, but it was effective. Delilah, already exhausted and terrified, began to waver in her resistance. The sheriff then introduced his most devastating threat. He told Delilah that if she did not confess immediately, he would arrest her 2 children and have them taken away from her permanently, sold to owners in the Deep South where she would never see them again. The prospect of losing her children, the only sources of love in her life, was more than Delilah could bear. Inside the cabin, Parker's men were making discoveries that would provide physical evidence to support whatever confession they extracted. In the fireplace, they found bone fragments that were clearly larger than any animal bones that would normally be burned. When they dug beneath the ash in the hearth, they uncovered larger pieces of charred bone that an experienced observer could identify as human remains. One of the men, digging along the cabin's foundation where the earth looked disturbed, found a piece of skull with distinctive features that made its human origin unmistakable. Another located what appeared to be finger bones buried in a shallow hole near the back of the cabin. The evidence was accumulating rapidly, creating a picture of deliberate concealment that could only mean one thing.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.